talk. We thought we would make it a more sociable event tonight. And this is an overly long talk. Okay, forgive me, Christine. It's about half an hour, thereabouts. About 30 minutes. I've sent you a message earlier saying it's very difficult for me to squeeze it into less. But we're doing a Laterna Magica type talk. This is the Laterna Magica. And the Laterna Magica is an old-fashioned projector. It was developed in Holland back in 1645 by Christian Huygens. And there was a long record before then of people attempting projection, but really he cracked it. And so today, when you turn on your phones and you look at a screen or go to the cinema, everything really stems back to Christian Huygens' invention. And this is a perfect working example. It's the only working example of magic lanterns. I have a number of them that do different functions, but it's the only example. And I think I collect slides that are to do with children's fairy stories, which I used for my own kids when they were young. And I have my mentor who worked in the Laterna Magica, who was an ex-BBC guy, said that I have now one of the largest collections of fairy tales in the world. And I like to use it every now and again and show it off. And I think that the slides, I hope you'll agree, are ethereally beautiful. But this is a very diminished presentation. I'm going to indecently squeeze the Laterna Magica into under 10 minutes as a talk. And then actually the main thrust of this isn't really the demonstration of a children's fairy tale, which is Little Red Riding Hood. Instead, the presentation is really about the history, the remarkable history of this unusual tale. And that's going to be more TED-style talk. It's going to be on a normal projector. We'll have the lights off for the Laterna Magica, and so the room will be in darkness. And normally, if you fall asleep, I feel like I've achieved my bedtime story objective. But tonight I'm going to kick you if you fall asleep, because actually the main thrust of the story is the story afterwards, the presentation afterwards, and that's going to be a normal, boring presentation, not on the Laterna Magica, but not boring in its content, right? I hope you'll find it very interesting. Okay, I think without further ado, I'll move on to the actual Laterna Magica presentation. For this bit, Luke, actually I won't ask you. Raf, can I ask you, if you don't hear me, you know, tough shit. No, if you don't hear me, tell me, because I'm facing this way, and so I'm having to shout in order for you to hear. Okay? Good, thank you. Okay, please can we have the lights off?
How much are these ones?
I think it's just outside. Once upon a time, a long, long time ago, far away in the forests of Germany, lived a young girl who lived tucked away in the forests of Germany so many centuries back that you can barely imagine it. And there she lived with her mum and her dad, and she enjoyed her life, playing in the fields and playing with her friends. And on the other side of the forest from her lived nearby her grandma. And her grandmother was forever doting on her. She found her an incredibly sweet child. And so, at a time where gifts were so expensive, and at this time of year where gifts are given, she had spent a year making her own little red coat. And the little girl loved her jacket, and she wore it everywhere. And over time, all of the villagers knew her as Little Red Riding Hood. Now, one day, a message came to her mother that Granny was very ill, that Granny was on the other side of the forest. And they decided that they needed to package up some bread and some sweet scones and some jam for her. And her mother said to her, "Remember, this time your father's away working in the forest, and you, I think, Little Red Riding Hood, are old enough to go by yourself. But don't stray from the path, and don't talk to strangers." Luke, you can go through with the smell. So I want you to smell the smell of the forest, and imagine being lost in time, centuries back. Or to sleep.
I'm not here.
So Little Red Riding Hood got everything ready. And her mother got all the provisions down from the shelf. And they spent some time packing everything into a basket. And then Little Red Riding Hood, happy with the contents and the presents for her granny, set off by herself like a big girl with her little red jacket over her shoulder. And she waved goodbye to her mother, and the dog scampered up the road until only so far. And then it, as though it knew itself that the forest was dangerous, turned its back on young Riding Hood, and she continued into the deep, dark depths of the forest. Now, as she went further, the sounds became stranger, and she realized, as it became darker all around, that she was in an unusual setting, that she'd never yet been by herself, left alone, all grown up like this, to walk through the forest on her own. And then in the background, she heard a terrible noise. And before she knew it, there was a scrabbling nearby. And with her heart racing, she turned, and sure enough, a large wolf was sitting next to her. The wolf turned to her and said, "Hello, little girl, what are you doing in the woods here so far away?" And Little Red Riding Hood, who was too polite for her own good, forgot all of the advice from her mother. And so she said to the stranger, "Oh, I'm here just to help my granny. She lives on the other side of these woods, don't you know?" And the wolf turned and said, "Oh, does she live in that house just next to the old ancient oak?" And Little Red Riding Hood said, "Yes." She said, "I know a shortcut there." He said, "If you turn to the right here, you'll be able to pick the most beautiful flowers, and you'll find it's far faster to go on this off-the-beaten track than it is on the main road." And so Little Red Riding Hood forgot the advice to stay on the path, and instead she strayed. She didn't go backwards in time. And instead, the wolf went racing ahead, and he arrived at Little Granny's house, who he'd espied for some time, and thought of her as quite a tasty snack, and knew that now that she was ill and somewhat compromised, maybe she would even be tastier and even easier. And so he tapped on the door, and Granny said, "Oh, who's that?" And the wolf muffled his voice and said, "It's Little Red Riding Hood." And she said, "Oh, Little Red Riding Hood, you sound a little strange, but why don't you press on the latch and step inside?" And so she went inside, or he went inside, and Granny had no idea what had happened. For the wolf arrived, and then he gobbled her up. And there was almost nothing left, or any evidence left of Granny whatsoever. And then the wolf, having filled his belly with Granny alone, decided that he would wait for Little Red Riding Hood. And he put on all of Granny's little bedclothes, and got the little bonnet right over his ears, and tied the little bow, and everything was fantastic and ready for his next and most scrumptious, younger, veal-like meal. Well, Little Red Riding Hood soon arrived, and she arrived at her grounds and thought, "Oh, it was such an odd journey. I've never been that way before. I nearly got completely lost." But having found there, she tapped on the door, and she heard Granny from inside, who sounded like she'd had a bit of a sore throat. "Who's that?" And Little Red Riding Hood said, "Oh, it's only I, Little Red Riding Hood, Granny." And she said, "Well, press on the latch and step inside." And so, like something out of the Crying Game, right? And so, Little Red Riding Hood stepped inside. And as she went in, she saw that Granny was very much tucked up in bed. And she got closer and she thought, "Oh, Granny looks very, very ill. She looks very, very different." And as she got closer, she said, "Oh, Granny," she said, "you must really be feeling out of sorts," she said. My, you look so different. I feel like I haven't seen you in ages, and you're so ill I barely recognise you. My, Granny, what big eyes you have. And the wolf turned around, and with his soft voice, he said, "Oh, all the better to see you with." And then she took a little step closer to the bed, and she saw the terrible claws sticking out from the bedclothes. And she said, my, Granny, what big hands you have today." She said, "Oh, it just happens when you're ill, you know," she says, "but all the better to hold you with, Little Red Riding Hood." And then she said, "But my, Granny," as she took one step closer, "your teeth look so huge." And the wolf revealed himself, saying, "All the better to eat you with." And as he scrambled out of bed, Little Red Riding Hood, shocked as she was, ran as fast as she could round to the other side of the bed. And then she ran under the bed, and she ran back and forth, all around, trying to get away from the wolf. But the wolf eventually caught her, and he ate her all up. Now, it's not quite done, because luckily for her, Little Red Riding Hood's protestations were heard in the distance by none other than her father, the woodcutter, who arrived and beat the wolf senseless. And luckily for her, gave her a bit of a squeeze, the wolf a bit of a squeeze, and out popped Little Red Riding Hood. And then, actually, if that wasn't enough, they decided that what were they going to do about Granny? So they took him to a local, very dubious veterinarian, and exactly. And the veterinarian promptly performed an operation, a gastrotomy, and hoiked out Granny, and wouldn't you believe it, Granny was still alive. And so they decided that the wolf needed to end his days in a zoo, because none of us like a sad ending, right? I mean, at least he wasn't, euthanized. And Little Red Riding Hood and Granny and Little Red Riding Hood's mum and dad all lived happily ever after. Who's going to have the lights back on? Now there's going to be a little technical interlude whilst I change between the 150-year-old projector and the modern day equivalent.
I once heard they found Little Red Riding Hood in an absolutely catastrophic state. Luckily, the paramedics found her in time and made her stable, but she wasn't out of the woods yet.
Good one.
Very good, very good.
So, how did this originally get lit up?
So originally these lanterns, when they first started, the very small lanterns were lit with candles, but more commonly then oil. And there were a number of different oils that were used, but I've actually got some lanterns that have the original parts, and we've tried them with candles, and we've tried them with oil, and they work. And you would think that it was a more romantic, ambient experience. It's not, it's just crap lighting. So it doesn't do the whole flickering thing or anything. There's a loss of colour. And so very rapidly what people did was transition through different lighting sources. I actually had some people in the Magic Lantern Society in Britain who were, they could, engineering types, but they actually delivered amazing talks on how lighting had developed. Things like limelight that you think of for the theatre, very dangerous light source to use. That's been used in these, and then it's moved to electrics and so on. So when I got this, someone had already transitioned it to an electric light bulb source. I transitioned it again to an LED light bulb source. And that's much better because you tend not to get this is a huge condenser lens. I mean, it's this big, it's like a telescope. And it cracks with high heat. And I've actually cracked one in usage before, and they're very difficult to replace. So, in this next part of the talk, what I really wanted to do was just remind you of the story of Little Red Riding Hood. And I hope you'll forgive me for, as adults, for taking you back to your early childhood, and telling you this wonderful fairy tale once again. But the purpose of this part of the talk, which will last about 20 minutes, the purpose of this part of the talk is to make you think far more carefully about the value of fairy tales. The purpose of this talk is so that at the end of it, I think you will be amazed, as I've been amazed, to discover the history, the remarkable history, and also a little bit, just a tiny inflection on some aspects of the psychology of this underlying story. So I've entitled this La Rage or Le Ravissement of Little Red Riding Hood. And we can come back to what I mean by that later. When we think of Little Red Riding Hood, as I have just done in this story here, you probably think of your own children or grandchildren, you probably think of your own childhood. And in that Anglo-Saxon sphere, you remember some sort of cartoonish story that was told to you as a child. But in fact, the origin of this story wasn't really in England. For most people, if I push them, let's just ask, where did the story come from?
Germany.
Germany?
France.
Brothers Grimm? France? Why France?
The title song.
French is a reasonable guess, we'll come to that. In fact, one of the things that made this most popular were the Brüder Grimm in Germany. And they published the story of Rotkäppchen. Now they didn't write the story. They weren't auteurs, as you'd say in French. They were adapteurs. They were they acquired stories, very often from a pub actually, just south of Kassel, where they were philologists, they studied literature. The Brüder Grimm weren't around that long ago. All right, this is actually, we think of it as of ancient tales, but they published their tales in about 1812 to 1815. And this on the right-hand side is actually a daguerreotype, so one of the original photos of the Brothers Grimm. In reality, although they popularized the stories for children across Europe, the person that is largely credited with this story is none other than this chap, Charles Perrault, on the right-hand side. And in 1697, he published Le Petit Chaperon Rouge. Now, Le Petit Chaperon Rouge, translated is the little red coat, was a quintessential story of the French court. And he, like another person that if you've been to one of my earlier lectures on the history of fairy tales, Madame d'Aulnoy, he was a contemporary of Madame d'Aulnoy. Madame d'Aulnoy was the person who created essentially the name for the genre, fairy tales, right? It's les contes du fées. This man here published in the same year as her, and published a number of famous stories, including Little Red Riding Hood, Le Petit Chaperon Rouge. And people sort of ask, well, where did this story come from? And once again, he was an adapteur. It wasn't his original story. And so part of the background to this was there was a fascination in France with the story of the wolf, if you will. One of these stories was particularly disturbing. And it stemmed from the stories around werewolves that were very popular immediately in the 50 years or so before Perrault published his book on this. Werewolves had been a subject of mystery and satanic practice for centuries, probably millennia before. But there was an extremely important development that happened in the 50, 60 years before Perrault published his book. There was a trial of a chap called Peter Stump that was a very well documented trial. Now Peter Stump was a farmer based in Germany, and he was a widower, and he had some fairly unusual habits. And to this day nobody knows whether he really was a serial killer or not, but various people started going missing, and he was accused of being a serial killer. And under torture he confessed, and he said at the age of 12 he had been interested in the dark arts, and he had consorted with the devil, who had provided him with a magical belt, and when he wore the belt he became a werewolf. And in his form as a werewolf he had eaten 14 children, including one of his own, 2 pregnant women, and had raped a number of women as well. He was prosecuted for this, and in a trial that shook Europe, his torture was probably the most dramatic of any particular individual in legal evidence. So he had hot tongs applied to him and his flesh stripped from him. There's a picture on the left-hand side. Then he had the blunt end of an axe applied to his limbs and all of his limbs broken. and finally he was decapitated. His head was mounted above an effigy of the wolf and posted in the village. His daughter, who he was accused of incest was burnt at the stake. This story resonated through Europe at this period of time, before Charles Perrault had published his story on Little Red Riding Hood. So wolves were not let's say, a favourably looked upon beast in medieval Europe. But maybe the story that relates to werewolves isn't the simple tale that we think. Maybe there's another feature behind this. It was already known in medieval times that individuals could appear with diseases that made them look like werewolves. There were paintings that are still in existence now of particularly hairy individuals. Franz, I'm looking at you. No, with hypertrichosis, so the beard, the beard started growing, but all over the face, for example, right? And this is an individual here, Lalit Patidar. This photo was taken not so long ago. And so this is a photo from just a few months ago. And this guy has hypertrichosis, the medical name for what is commonly known as werewolf syndrome. There are other biological features. Any biologists amongst us? Anyone recognise the top left picture? Or if you're a pathologist, the bottom left picture? Right, the top left picture is an electron microscopic view of a characteristic shape of the rabies virus. Okay? And this rabies virus, when it infects cells, that's a single rabies virus. The bottom left picture is of a neurone, and the little dark entries within there are thousands and thousands of virus particles together. When I was working in Hong Kong, we had a case which we were fearful was actually a case of canine rabies present there. And rabies is, of course, transmitted by a variety of animals, but famously wolves. If you've ever seen the film 28 Days Later or 28 Weeks Later, who's seen that? Features like modern, catastrophic zombie apocalypse type thing. And lots of humans suddenly get affected by a virus that turns them into incredibly aggressive individuals. Well, in fact, rabies does that, not quite as dramatically as the rage virus in the film, but rabies essentially does that. If you think we're past it, we're not. This is an example of a child, and the sound's not on, but he's making howling sounds and uncontrollable shaking movements. He shows hydrophobia. He's not able to swallow, which is a great way for the virus to replicate because all the saliva pours out and then potentially contaminates other individuals. These individuals can famously become aggressive. They will spit and bite other people as well, just like the dogs around them. Once you show neurological signs, it's invariably fatal. Disease, whether it's in the form of having a hairy face like werewolf syndrome, or whether you have rabies, was a great initiator of worries concerning wolves. But that wasn't the only concern. Perhaps Perrault was influenced by something that had happened in the late medieval period and that still echoed in French memory, and in fact was a problem across more of Europe. Around 1450 and in the winter, they were incredibly cold winters in this period. It was what was known as the Little Ice Age of Europe. And very famously, wolves were documented entering the city, within the city walls of Paris, a highly unusual setting, and they rampaged through the streets, killing 40 over time, killing 40 children, mainly children and women. Eventually the citizens of Paris killed a number of these wolves, chased them into a courtyard at the back of Notre Dame Cathedral and slaughtered the wolves. The point is, wolves were not a popular animal at that point in time. But we have to go back even further. If we go back to 1023, 1,000 years ago, it seems like an impossibly long period ago, Liège of Egbert of Liège, the monk, monastic teacher, was working at the monastic school and wrote the first account, which to this day you can see, it's held in the Cologne Library, of Little Red Riding Hood. It's thought to be the first written account, 1,000 years old. You can still visit it today. And if we were to push it back even further in European history, it's actually very similar to a story that, who read Aesop's fables when they were a kid? Okay, so it's the wolf and the kid, the little goat kid, right? It's that story that's actually very, very similar in story motif type to Little Red Riding Hood. Now you're back to 500, 600 BC. So far what we've done is travel through history in Europe. But in fact, one of the things that folklorists have done is look at where these tales come from. And remarkably, this tale is told everywhere from Antigua in the Caribbean, all the way out to Asia and down to southern Africa. The Asian story is almost the same, but it changes the wolf for a tiger. So it's the grandmother and the tiger. The earliest published example of that in China is at the 18th century, so it doesn't claim to be older. And then I'm going to come to this seminal piece of work. In this piece of work by a guy called Jim Tarani, based at the University of Durham in England, he's a biologist and he studies using phylogenetics probability relationships. And tiny little technical stuff here. If you're looking at phylogenetics and you're a biologist, you're looking at relatedness, and you're using genetics to tell you about relatedness. So the cat is more related to the lion than it is the dog, and we can quantify the probability of that and put it on a map. And that's how, in modern biology, you look at relatedness between species. The same technique can be used for stories. It's used for a number of other cultural things, so it's kind of then called phylomimetics, so for memes instead of phylogenetics. And the idea is, much like a gene that mutates over time, a story might be told between the two of us, and then you tell the story and there's a slight change, in other words, a mutation. And what we can look at is the mutation rates over time. What he did was look at the mutations in these stories over time from around the world, using current database motifs that are already present for fairy tale stories. And what he found was remarkable. Two things. The first was that there were groupings of these stories in Africa, in Asia, and in Europe, but it looks as though the oldest stories came from Europe or the near Middle East. And the second thing that he found that was very remarkable was the age. Now, for some of you who've been at one of those talks that I've given before on the history of fairy tales, you'll know that the remarkable thing is that these stories now, we're not talking 1,000 years back. We're talking 6,000 to 10,000 years back. And this has been published by other people as well. So the biological evidence makes it look as though the stories of it's not just, some old manuscript at a cathedral in Cologne now. It looks as though we've been telling these stories. You've been telling these stories to your children. You've been listening to these stories in an unbroken line for millennia. And the story in China is very similar to the story in southern Africa, is very similar to the story in Europe. So there might be a bit of a jump here. And it might be hard for the men in the room to sort of concentrate on the academic considerations at this point in time. But what I want to say is that I'm going to briefly touch on the psychology now and then complete the talk. And really, I don't think we are talking just about rabies, or about werewolf trials with Peter Stump, or about wolf invasions into Paris. What these stories that have been present for millennia are telling us, they're almost canonical, they're almost quasi-religious. These are stories that we have passed on because they say something fundamental about the biology of us. So you listen to them as a childhood story, but they're really a warning. Now, in the last 100 years, I would say that that warning has been subverted by feminism. And so we have the coquettish Little Red Riding Hood, okay? Whose, her burgeoning sexuality represented by red, the onset of menstruation, sexual promiscuity highlighted by the colour red. These aren't accidental considerations. These sorts of things have been are a marker of our underlying psychology in relation to this story. But what we think of in the last 100 years is how strong Little Red Riding Hood was, and how she managed to subvert the wolf. There are whole genres published in feminist literature about how strong women are, and about the defeat of the wolf. A great movie, if you haven't seen it, is The Company of Wolves. Take a good look at it. There's maybe I shouldn't say too much, there are some young people here, but you know, you can find a variety of interesting erotica and interesting feminist literature on Little Red Riding Hood. And yet, we cannot escape the fact that Little Red Riding Hood is a far more archaic psychosocial tale. I don't think the preceding two images of the somewhat encouraging and more adult, pubescent Little Red Riding Hood necessarily capture as carefully the reality of life. This picture by Gustave Doré was an engraving, and on the right you see an almost childlike girl who was told in the story to remove one article of clothing at a time in one of the original translations of Perrault, and then to burn her clothing and to get into bed alongside the wolf. Biological reality is a harsh thing. On the left-hand side is an image of a Belgian blue bull. I've had to carve those cows before when I was a young vet. Basically, most of them you can't, right? Because the muscling on those animals is so huge, they have to go to caesarean section. Believe me, when you're in the room with that, you know the difference between a bull and a cow. Sexual dimorphism makes no apologies, it just is. So regardless of your ideology and what might fit and what might not fit, I don't think that we can escape the reality. And what I want you to reflect on tonight are these ancient, multiple millennia fairy tales that have travelled almost undiluted, almost until the last 100 years of feminism, from one generation to another. The key issue is that wolves sometimes appear in gentlemen's clothing, and young ladies of good repute should be very careful of the strangers that they meet in the woods. Thank you.
To resist the attack on feminism. Obviously he hasn't watched the movie My Big Fat Greek Wedding. Everybody knows the man may be the head, but the woman is the neck. Thank you.